about 6:31 right now. You all can hear me okay? Okay, we're gonna get started here. So hopefully the stream has begun, and I would like to say hello and thank you and welcome everyone joining us here for our Toms River NEA Big Read Keynote event 2020, featuring Burning Bright author Ron Rash. My name is Mike Hay, and I am the grant writer and communications contact for Toms River Regional Schools. And along with Mr. Rash, I'm joined here tonight by our NEA Big Read co-directors, Tanya Rivera and Christy Downs, who have done just an outstanding job with this program always, but especially this year. Because like many things in 2020, this year's program and this keynote event in particular look a little different than we had planned. Mr. Rash was going to be here live and in person this past May, but you know what? We are making it work, and there are actually many positives to be found, and we are actually just discussing those positives before the stream launched. Anyone and everyone, for example, can stream this event from wherever they are, which we think has increased exposure for this wonderful book and its brilliant author. And we think this gives more people the chance to be actively involved. And in saying that, I want to reiterate that we encourage all of you who are out there watching tonight to please tweet us your questions. We're happy to ask Ron Rash any questions that you have. So tweet us at WeAreTRSchools or at TRBigRead. We'll be monitoring the feed tonight, and whatever you want to ask, we're happy to do so on your behalf. Earlier this afternoon, Mr. Rash provided us a keynote presentation just for our students and teachers who are studying Burning Bright through their curriculum. A curriculum developed, by the way, by Tanya Rivera and Christy Downs and their team of unbelievable teachers. And I will tell you that that keynote event was awesome. So I can say for a fact that all of you joining us tonight are in for a treat. On behalf of our district, I must also take time to thank the National Endowment for the Arts and Arts Midwest for enabling us to offer this free and amazing program and event through their NEA Big Read grant. I'd also like to thank our invaluable community partners, especially Ocean County Library and Ocean County College, along with many others. I also have to thank the Toms River School Board and our admin team. I'm not sure how many people are aware, but Toms River Regional Schools is the first school district to ever earn the NEA Big Read grant. This opportunity is not really custom to school districts. So to have a board and a leadership team who supports programs like these that are really outside of the box ways to learn more and become engaged with literacy, it's really amazing, and I'm really proud of what this district is able to accomplish, and we can't do that without support from the top. So I definitely like to thank the board and our administrative team. And of course, I have to thank our special guest, Ron Rash, who will take some time tonight to discuss his book, Burning Bright, his career, and to answer some questions. Mr. Rash is an accomplished writer, to say the least. He's also an educator, and his remarkable book, Burning Bright, has been the talk of our district and this community for the past few months. He won the prestigious Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award in 2010 for Burning Bright, among many other laudable achievements for an array of work. The Huffington Post has described him as a writer of quiet and stunning beauty. And for me, I don't think there's any phrase that better captures Ron Rash, the author, or the book, Burning Bright, itself. As someone who's been communicating with Mr. Rash, or Ron, because he lets me call him Ron, for which I'm very flattered and honored, over the past few months, I can also happily report that he is just a super nice and down-to-earth guy. And that's something that you are all about to discover for yourselves. And with that, I yield the virtual floor to this evening's keynote speaker, author Ron Rash.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I would be even more glad if I were there, literally. As I mentioned to the students today, my daughter teaches high school in near Camden, New Jersey, and this was going to be a great event for me in several ways, one of which would be being with her. And actually, she was going to come with me to meet me in Toms River, and we were going to have a nice day together as well. But I am glad that we can at least do this. I want to thank Michael and Tanya and Christy. I know I've done events not to this magnitude, but I've done events with writers and setting them up. There's a lot of work, and sometimes it's not a lot of fun filling out grants, but it was done well, and I had a good experience with the students. They very impressed with their questions, particularly the students who were middle school. That was amazing that they're such good readers that young. So that was great. And I thought tonight, it's interesting because just to tell a little story, a few months ago, I went to work out at my YMCA, and the woman who works there has known me for years, and she said, "Well, someone saw me and said, well, asked me about you. They knew that I worked out there, and they." She said, "Well, what's he like? What's Ron Rash like?" And my friend said, the woman there said, "Well, he's kind of quiet, but he's nice. He's friendly. Always says hello." And then the friend said, "No, I mean, what's he really like? I mean, disturbed. That dark part of him." And I thought that was pretty funny because sometimes I think people, sometimes because of my work, think that I am that kind of Edgar Allan Poe-like character. I hope I'm not. As I was talking about earlier today, I think what I'm very interested in is situations in which people are put in very stressful situations, awful, because it's a moment where they reveal who they really are, and they also find out very often the people they can depend on. We see the worst and best revealed. But I did want to start off with a little bit of wonder, because as I think you could tell from my work, I love the natural world. I was very lucky in that where I grew up in North Carolina, I spent a lot of time. My grandmother's farm bordered the Blue Ridge Parkway. I live only 15 miles from the Smoky Mountains National Park, so I'm in a very rural area, and I love being there. But I wanted to read just two very brief excerpts from my novel Above the Waterfall, because they're descriptions given by a young woman who's a park ranger, and she's had some trauma in her life, but she finds healing in nature. And she does this by really observing nature minutely. So I just wanted to give a little sense of her sense of wonder. This is about a little earlier. I don't know if you all have black-eyed Susans in New Jersey. Do you have those flowers? Good. Because they're very beautiful, and particularly as you get into the fall, they start to almost glow. The flower is so bright yellow, and or the center of it. So this is just a description of a night. The bats are starting to move around, the fireflies, and she's seeing all of this, but she's just kind of looking over this meadow in the Appalachian Mountains. Though sunlight tinges the mountains, black leather-winged bodies swing low. First, fireflies blink languidly. Beyond this meadow, cicadas rev and slow like sewing machines. All is ready for night except night itself. I watch last light lift off level land. Ground shadows seep and thicken. Circling trees form banks. The meadow itself becomes a pond filling. On its surface, dozens of black-eyed Susans. I sit on the ground, cooling, soon dew damp. Near me, a moldboard plow long left. Honeysuckle vines twined green cords, white flowers attached like Christmas lights. I touch a handle slick from wrist shifts and sweaty grips. Memory of my grandfather's hands, calluses round and smooth as worn corns. One morning I watched him cross the field, the still ore rippling soil. In its wake, a caught wave of Cillian shine. But this plow has wearied into sleep. How long lying here? Perhaps a decade since saplings and sawbriar rise amid broom sedge. Above all else, the high hover of black-eyed Susans, bright yellow and full petaled bloom. What has brought me here? A deer emerges from the woods. Nose up, stilt step, then steadying pause. Another hoof lifted. Dark rises around me. The Susans float like water lilies. All else disappears, but they hold their yellow glow. Moon mirrors, sun ghost. And one more paragraph. There are certain words, I think this, I write poetry as well as fiction, and I love there are certain words that I love, and probably maybe my single favorite word is murmuration. If you're someone who's interested in birds, you know this term. It's a term, it's something you, all of us have seen, I'm sure, when starlings gather and they start to form these flocks, but then they start to move as one. And in the United States, those flocks tend to be fairly small, but I was in Europe a few years ago in France on a book tour, and I saw thousands at one time do this. And it's just amazing kind of rippling of the sky with that. And but Becky, the narrator, sees this when she's passing. She's bicycling, but she passes a field that's just been cut. A hayfield appears, recently mown. Its blonde stubble blackened by a flock of starlings. As I pass, the field seems to lift, peak to see what's under itself, then resettle. A pickup passes from the other direction. The flock lifts again, and this time keeps rising, a narrowing swirl as if sucked through a pipe, and then an unfurl of rhythm sudden sprung, becoming one entity as it wrinkles, smooths out, drifts down like a snapped bed sheet, then swerves and shifts, gathers and twists. Murmuration, ornithology's word poem for what I see. 200 starlings at most, but in Europe, sometimes 10,000, enough to punctuate a sky. So if the book was too depressing, the stories, at least you can see a sense of wonder there. And that book actually is one where I wanted to write about wonder. And I think that's something we sure have needed with what's happened with COVID the last year. And one of the advantages for me is that I've been able to spend a lot of time outdoors, and I found that very restorative. So I think right now what we will do, I think Michael and Tanya and Christy may have a few questions to start us off. And then we can certainly have questions from the audience. Yeah.
That sounds perfect, Ron. And that was really quite a treat to hear you read your own writing. It's going to be hard for me to read Burning Bright again without hearing your voice, and it's going to add so much to it. And yeah, I think what we're going to do now is we do have some questions lined up. We're taking some tweets, and I believe that Tanya and Christy may have some from their teachers and students. Tanya, do you or Christy want to kick us off?
I do have one to kick us off because it has to do with that rereading. So when I actually reread the book so the first time my daughter was on this like kind of long extended nap, so I didn't get to annotate. And I needed the book so quickly that I had to order the digital text. So this was the first book I read for the first time fully digital. So when I went back, I had to write in the book, my traditional thing. But one of my teachers had asked me after the first reading, she was like, well, is there any connection between the stories? And I was like, well, I think there's a cumulative impact. But then when I went back and reread it, there was like a part in the gorge where he talks about certain ancestors. And then in another story, the one about the superstition, the one we were talking about, the
corpse bird, yeah.
Corpse bird. In the corpse bird, he talks about certain ancestors as well. And I was like, oh, I wonder if they're connected to. And I said, are these stories connected? So that was one of the questions that came up.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you recognize that. Actually, the story, several of the stories actually take place on the same road. Return, when the soldier comes back from World War II, that road is the one that Lincolnites is set on, the same road that was in the 1860s. So you are an astute reader, and you so that's yeah. And Hard Times, the first story, is set on that road. So you're on this road, essentially, within 150-year period, moving. And I love doing that. And I love when I write a book of stories. I'm glad you brought out the idea of connectedness, because these characters are connected. Sometimes they are, though I don't make it over obvious, they are related. I mean, actually, genealogically. But I love to give the reader a sense of time being in flux. I like that by moving through time in the stories, that the reader sometimes a little bit unmoored, not quite sure what period I'm in, and yet within this landscape. So my hope is that I'm giving a sense of this place over a large amount of time, and I think that feeling and the certain repetitions of history coming back, the sense of the landscape always being there, an unchanging landscape. All of those matters were very important, and I'm glad that you sense the connectedness, because to me, a book of short stories, whenever I put together a short story collection, it's like a musician putting together a CD. You hope that the sum is greater than the individual parts, that the reader, having gone through this collection, feels something has connected and tied this together into something that is a little bit more than just individual stories. And I mean, I had 4 or 5 stories I really felt good about, but I just didn't feel like they fit this book, so I didn't put them in.
So just to kind of piggyback off of that, if you don't mind me asking like another question, you had mentioned earlier this afternoon that, Morrison was an author whose work you really appreciated. And when she had won the Nobel Prize, she was actually compared to Faulkner. And, what you're saying kind of reminds me of Toni Morrison's concept of rememory, this idea that once a setting has something that happens there, it's always happening there, like it always exists. And so would you say that there are any specific authors you feel have really influenced your work?
Yeah. Well, I think, as I mentioned today, I mean, a number of writers, certainly Morrison, I've learned a lot from her. And particularly the way she has such a gift for taking seemingly minor characters and making them memorable. I think that's one of her superb talents. But I think Faulkner taught me a lot. He actually has a quote, pretty well-known quote, where he says, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." And I hope that, that's feeling you get in these stories, that the past continues to kind of ripple into the present. That there echoes different Hard Times is the first story, but I think we sense that Hard Times are not limited to one time, and so that we kind of see that movement of history, but also of times when people are under a lot of pressure. And I think it's surprising that I would pick the 1930s, very traumatic time, World War II, Civil War, and then with the meth and Oxycontin plague. So I'm kind of hitting these pressure points in this world, this society. But I would, at the same time, I would sense that the stories, though they're set very deeply in Appalachia, that they resonate out, that these are common concerns that we all societies, particularly Tom's River with the hurricane and also some similar problems with drugs that my area certainly has. And so they're about people put in those situations and how do they respond. And I think in that way, I'm a fairly optimistic person, because I think most people, to quote Faulkner again, Faulkner said he believed that most people were a little bit better than their circumstances ought to allow. And I believe that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Just to change gears a little bit, Mr. Rash, many teachers at my level, the intermediate level, 6 through 8, I did teach return over the course of today, tomorrow, the next day, to try to time it with Veterans Day, which is tomorrow.
Yeah.
Which I honestly hadn't even thought of myself. I thought that when I read that in multiple different lesson plans, I thought that was a really cool idea. Can you tell us, and I know you did that this afternoon, but you dedicated that story to someone. And can you tell everyone a little bit about why you wrote that story, your inspiration for that story?
Yes, and that it is, I think, very relevant to Veterans Day, because the story is based on my uncle Robert, who during I think what's interesting is how often a memory of childhood lingers, and I so many times something that I actually saw in my childhood has lingered and later become a story. Perhaps because when we're children, we see the world with a kind of brilliance, a kind of sense of newness and certain memories. But what I remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old was that when I'd visit my Uncle Robert, he was a hunter. This is rural North Carolina. And he had 4 or 5 rifles and shotguns racked in his front room. And one had a different coloration. It was more beautiful. It had it looked like teak, and it had a kind of orange color to it. And I was intrigued by that. And I asked him about it. And over the years, I heard the story several times that during World War II, he was fighting in the Pacific Theater, was on one of the islands. And as he was walking through a path, very dense foliage, a Japanese sniper directly above him shot, and the bullet deflected off his helmet. He, in turn, shot and killed the man who had tried to kill him. And that was the rifle that had shot him, and he had brought it home. And what I found particularly interesting about that is that here was a man who had been put in the worst of human circumstances, in a place where it's kill or be killed. And yet he was an incredibly kind, gentle man and very good to me. And this particular story was one that I wrote to honor him. That's why I dedicated it to him. And but it was interesting because as I told the students today, this is where we as writers, we go sometimes, I think the difference between an artistic truth and a factual truth is that the artistic truth doesn't have to necessarily be exactly what happened. And my point being that he did actually come home and have to walk up that same road that all those other stories are set on, so many of them. But he, at the end of the story, I actually have him take the helmet and break the ice and drink from the spring, the very source. So, I mean, in a sense, you think about the ocean. I mean, it's not the Atlantic, but the idea that he's come all the way back over an ocean and now he's back to this source. Now that did not happen, but I would argue it's true to the story and true to a kind of truth I wanted to convey about him. So yeah, that was a story in which I wanted to honor him in many ways, Yeah.
So Ron, I'm going to go next, and this is a question that is both my own, but it's also a combination of some feedback I've acquired because we've had a lot of staff members and a lot of my colleagues who have read Burning Bright. So last year, our NEA Big Read selection was Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And in that wonderful book, there is a scene with a water buffalo that for me was the most difficult thing to read in that entire book. And in Burning Bright, and the reason I wanted to ask this is because you touched on it this afternoon and I found it fascinating, and I want everyone to hear your thoughts on it. Right off the bat in this book, in Hard Times, there's a scene with a dog. And I just wanted to ask you kind of a twofold question. If you could touch on what you did this afternoon about how you arrived at the conclusion to include that. And B, why do you think as readers, it's so difficult to witness these traumatic things happening to pets, almost more than human beings?
Yeah. Well, that is interesting. I've killed several hundred people in my work. When I think about that, but the only two deaths that really haunt me are I had to kill a horse in my first novel, and that was hard. But killing the dog in Hard Times was the hardest. I'm being completely serious. It was the hardest scene or moment in anything I've ever written. I love dogs. I grew up with dogs, and I knew there was a risk in that scene because I think many readers could just say, well, this is too much. I've got to turn away from this. And yet, as I really pondered whether to take that out, and there was a part of me that wanted to, and yet I knew that to be true to that story, to be true to that world, and to give a sense to the reader of how hard this place was, I had to have that scene. I had to have that moment. And I had to have it because I think at the end, when we see Jacob with the girl, there's that moment where he almost sounds brutal, or does sound brutal, never come back. And we understand that moment, why he has to say that, because what he has seen. And to me, it's a terrible moment, and it's a terrible moment in many ways because you realize, as unsympathetic as we are to this man who does it, it's all he's got left is his pride. I mean, we see that twice when he's offered the food. I mean, he has nothing left. And to me, that moment where this is obviously an animal, I mean, I don't think he's a brutal man. I mean, that dog is not afraid of him. But to me, that's when I take that story into, I think, the deepest part of hard times, of hard choices, of people, particularly in that story, because I think we see Edna do some things, particularly with her children, that are very troubling. And yet, if that story works, I think the reader is always in a situation, I hope the reader's in a situation where, and yet I can understand this. And to me, that's the tragedy of the story, that these are all people doing what they feel they have to do in many ways to survive. And so, yeah, I felt like that story had to set a tone that would resonate through the whole book. And, but I've always felt, I don't say this flippantly. I will never do that again. I'll never write it. I don't think I can. I don't think I can. So don't think I'm a heartless person, because I love animals, and it really bothers me when they're abused. Yeah.
So, Mr. Rash, I think that's really interesting that, Mike brought up Tim O'Brien, because Tim O'Brien says something very similar about that line between fiction and nonfiction, right? And how he literally says, like you were saying, like, is it true in a sense of truth? No, but is it true in a sense of something a little deeper at what might have been true? So good call with that connection, because I was also thinking the water baby buffalo scene is pretty difficult in that book, and it does connect back to hard times. But you opened by being really hard on yourself about, or just kind of saying, they always say, oh, here's Ron Rash, writer of sad stories. But Dead Confederates, I loved that story personally, and I don't think it got any props today. So I really want to kind of mention it, only because here are these, two characters up to some pretty insidious, no good stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I found myself laughing the whole time, like it's hysterical, right? And I'm like, wait a second, Tanya. These people are robbing graves to sell off things that people were buried with, which is kind of sacred, right? So I was wondering if you could, talk a little bit, because it's a funny story, I think, but it's dark too, right? So there's kind of using humor to kind of examine these things these characters are doing. And I think you mentioned it a little bit, but for me, I felt like every single character, even the unlikable ones, there were elements where you could understand what they were doing, even when what they were doing was awful, because they were going through hard times. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the humor and that particular story.
Yeah, I love to write humor. I do that in some books more than others, but one thing I think I learned from Shakespeare, and particularly in Macbeth, that is his darkest, that and Lear, those are his two darkest plays. But there's a scene right after the murder of the king, where there's a knocking at the gate. It's a comic scene. And I felt like my reader in this book needed that kind of break. Now, it's a very kind of dark humor, a little bit like Alfred Hitchcock's humor at times. But the reader needs to laugh a little, to let some of that, at least nervous kind of laughter out. I think that's the kind of laughter you're talking about, where I shouldn't be laughing at this, but I am. And I wanted it to be that way. Yeah, it was a lighter story in some ways. You're right. And I think at the end, what I had to do was really kind of turn it a little bit. But and I thought, the challenge of that story is, and I'm glad you feel this way, is that particularly with the narrator, that we at least understand why he's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for his mother. And it really kind of becomes a commentary about a kind of system that would put him in that kind of situation, where that's the only alternative. So I'm glad you found humor in it. I think Waiting for the End of the World, I hope, has some humor in it. And that was probably the story that was fun to write. But yeah, I think I needed some breaks, even though when you look at those stories, you realize that all these people are still kind of in these really hard situations. Yeah.
So, Mr. Rash, one of my favorite stories, and Tanya can attest to this because I talked about it from the beginning, was Lincolnites. And you did speak about this afternoon, but you talked about how there's also just like Return, there's a kind of a family connection with that particular story. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for those who weren't in attendance?
Yeah, and that's good, because we just talked about Dead Confederates, and both of these stories bring up something that a lot of people don't realize, that in the southern Appalachian Mountains, there was a lot of Union support during the Civil War. A lot of that had to do with the geography. These were small farmers. There was slavery in these areas, but very little compared to, say, the lower South, where you had plantations. There weren't plantations. So I had two relatives who had pictures taken during the Civil War, soldiers, and they both are wearing Union uniforms, which, as I tell people, we were on the right side in my family. So Lincolnites is actually a story based on family lore. My great grandmother, I never can quite keep that straight, but she was on a farm near, actually, as I say, on that same road between near Boone, North Carolina, where my grandmother's farm, where I spent a lot of my childhood. But during the Civil War, she was, I've heard different accounts were a little bit vague as how old she was. She was a teenager. I do know that, probably 17, maybe 18. But she already was pregnant, and her husband had gone to East Tennessee because that's where Union sympathizers would join the Union Army, and she was there alone, that young, with a child, and a man who claimed to be a Confederate. He might have just kind of been a thief. But he came up from Boone and came up that road and actually came into the yard and said, I'm taking your horse for the Confederate Army, which may or may not have been true, probably wasn't. But he did it. He took the horse, and as he was leaving and he went past her and he started whistling Dixie. And she said, "You'll be whistling Dixie in hell by morning." And he walked on down and went on down that road. And about a mile, maybe a mile and a half farther down, the next morning, they found his body in a creek face down, and the horse was back in the barn. And in reality, it was older men in the community. She had told them what had happened, and they'd gone after him. They may have seen him come up there in the first place. But once again, I felt to be true to that, the kind of stories I was writing, but also to be true to her and her heroism. I needed her to be the one that would dispatch him. But once, as I do in the story, The Ascent, I don't like character. I don't like black and white situations, a good and evil, and I hope that the reader senses that, to me, in some ways, tragic moment where he actually, that small act of kindness to her as a child, that he remembers her in another time, and this time has hardened him as much, as it's hardened her. Now, maybe in more ways him. But to me, those are the moments where I think literature can do some heavy work by refusing to give us these easy answers. We go into, William Faulkner said, the human heart in conflict with itself. And I think those are the moments that we all, if we're lucky, maybe we have very few of those in our lives, but I think most people do. Those moments when things become very murky, very complex, and we wish for easy answers, but they don't come. And I think this is sometimes the realm of art. And also it's very often it's in the moments of great conflict. I mean, sometimes people ask, well, why is there so much sometimes trauma, violence in literature? And I think the artist, the significant artist, it's never that you're trying to titillate the audience. What you are trying to do is you're putting characters in extreme situations to show their character. You want a revelation of character, because it's only in the most stressful moments that the masks are dropped off, that we really realize maybe who we are, maybe who our friends are, who will disappoint us in these moments, who will step forward. And to me, that's when we really get to the core of what it means to be a human being. And one aspect that I've been very pleased with is that, my work's, I think, in about 20 languages now. And I get letters occasionally from other countries, from China, where I actually have a pretty good audience, France, New Zealand, South America. Occasionally I'll get an email. And what I really like is that sometimes they will be from mountain communities and just talk about the physical landscape and how they feel like I captured the way the light would come into a cove, into a dark area. But the more meaningful ones are where they say, I understand your character's motivations. I mean, your world on the surface is so different, but at the same time, it certainly reflects my understanding of what we were like as human beings. And I was in France about 8 years ago, and one of my novels, my first novel, I had not a young woman, a woman, I guess maybe, still young to me, still 40s. And she said, you've written the story of my life in this novel. And I thought, well, that's what you hope for. You hope that, not maybe to that level, but actually some things that had happened in the novel had happened to her, but I think she felt like the feelings were right.
So I love that part. And speaking of kind of like, you've talked a lot about like Faulkner and Morrison, and I think like, some of their works you could argue are somewhat inaccessible, I think, to like just every person type of audience. And what I loved most about your book, and still do, is that it's very literary while still being accessible without shutting out a whole bunch of readers because they don't study English, or, I feel like people can pick this up and have a very literary experience that's readily accessible. And, speaking of like rereads, one of the things that also jumped out at me in a lot of stories was a heartbeat, and like heart racing, or hearts were making moves in, a lot of the stories. And I thought I didn't get that the first time. So it was really beautiful. Excuse me. Wait, I need that real quick, please. So one of the questions we have on Twitter is from one of my teachers, and sorry. And it's from Laura Morgan. She's one of our teachers at High School East, just an extraordinary educator. And I love this question. So she writes, Mr. Rash, you've been both a teacher and an author. Often it seems the teaching and learning of a book gets unwittingly divorced from the writing and reading experience of a book. Speaking from your dual lens, how would you want your book taught and learned? Yeah,
that is always an interesting question for me, because I am a teacher. I've taught high school, community college, and now at a university. And I always worry as a teacher when I'm teaching, because even now when I teach students who are interested in creative or fiction writing, I teach a class where they write as well. I have them read a lot, and we talk about, and what I would say, I call it the architecture of the story, those kind of matters. And also, but I think you're right. I mean, I always worry that it's going to end up like we're dissecting a frog. It just kind of becomes this kind of heartless thing. And yet, I also know that when one of the great things for me was having my literature teachers. I had particularly two great literature teachers, and they enabled me to appreciate the story more on levels I would not have gotten before. And I think that's what I hope that I can do for my students, even if it's in a creative writing class, that, I'm teaching them, we can learn from how F. Scott Fitzgerald sets up the pacing of The Great Gatsby. We can learn from how the first sentence of Stephen Crane, a New Jersey writer, The Open Boat, none of them knew the color of the sky, which is one of my favorite opening lines. But I think the goal is that we never let the students forget that a human being wrote this, and that ultimately it's, at least I feel that almost all literature I'm most interested in is an attempt to, what does it feel like to be alive in the world? And that we don't want to get over analytical. But as I say, I think my goal is, and I think this is perhaps a good the way I address it to my students when I teach literature, and I have. What I want you to do, I want you to love this story on the level that you first read it. What I want to do is I want to allow you the possibility of looking at the story and reading it on maybe another level, but ultimately to enrich the pleasure of your reading, that you can, that there are different levels. And that's what I love about rereading. And to me, a real test of a book is the second time you read it. If it's better the second time, and sometimes for me, the books I love the most just keep opening up. Moby Dick's my favorite American novel, and I probably read that 10 times, and every time I read it, it just gets greater and greater. But yeah, I think we just forget that, it's not, and I think this can happen with poetry too, that we get so analytical that we forget that just the pleasure. And I think in literature, we can talk about what literature does, but to me, a very important component is what a poet named James Dickey says, the difficult pleasure of literature. That it does take a lot to get it sometimes, but ultimately, it's what you receive from that's a greater pleasure. And I think that's where language is important, I would add, because there are writers. I deliberately decided I didn't want to have that high rhetoric that you might see with Faulkner, Morrison, Joyce, Cormac McCarthy. So I really wrote, I tend to write more concise sentences, but I'm very aware of trying to be as visual as possible. And I'm very interested in rhythm, the way that vowel and consonant sounds play off one another, which syllables are stressed. But I want to hide it. I don't want the reader to draw attention to it. And I think sometimes when I read Faulkner, you just sense that he's, I love his work, but there are times when you think, okay, you've shown off enough. Let's go on.
But that's the beauty. I think Burning Bright does show off without being a show off. And that's kind of like the inherent paradox. But what for me will just be this work of literature that I think you can always go back to. It sounded like you started to say, even if you read it a third time, which I did, and it was an even richer experience. And I say that's very true of Morrison as well, but completely different styles of writing. And yet you can still see the influence, which for me is pretty awesome. So thank you.
Yeah, we've got a great tradition in America, and I've learned a lot.
Mr. Rash, I wanted to ask about the title. Obviously, the title of the book is also the title of one of the stories. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I guess I'm curious as to whether that was your decision to choose that title for the book, one of the titles of the stories and use it as the title of the book, or do you feel like that's, I guess I was just curious about the title, because I'm always curious about how an author chooses a title for a book, because it just must be such a big decision.
Oh yeah. And what I hope the reader got is certainly the reference to the William Blake poem, Tiger, Tiger, burning bright. But what the part I want to mention is burning bright in the forest of the night. So in this darkness, there's something that continues to shed light, to glow, to not expire. And I hope that in these stories, because very often these characters are in very dark situations. I mean, they're kind of in that Dante-esque dark wood, and yet there's some kind of light that in many of the stories, at least, not all, continues. I mean, that moment where I finished the story with Lily, the last story, there's a kind of order that's been restored. She's survived this ordeal. She's got this child coming. The war may soon be over. And I think she has survived. I mean, she's I think she's not been over traumatized. I mean, she will go on. And I think in a number of these stories, we see people coming out of that darkness, you know, in return, a soldier who's almost been killed. I mean, the trauma of that. In several of the other stories. Now, there are characters that don't survive that, though I would say that maybe the decency of Jacob in hard times, that this man, there's something in him that still has not been completely destroyed. You know, there is a kind of light within him to do the right thing, to try to be a good person. So yeah, you know, so I felt like that was my hope, that there was a sense of that. I think, you know, particularly when in that couple, you know, in the forest of the night, I mean, that idea that there's something that human that won't expire, something good in at least a number of the characters. I mean, even in the Corpse Bird, I think we sense that the central character, as terrible as all that's happened, there was something that motivated him that was the best of us, you know, that he really believed in his own, you know, in his mind, that he had to do this act against the darkness, you know, in a way. And, you know, perhaps it won't be understood if you take that as a kind of Halloween story. Maybe he did. How do we know? Maybe that's what he had to do to save that child within that world.
My next question is somewhat related to Christie's, because I've personally been fascinated that, you know, of these 12 stories, that Burning Bright was chosen as the title of the book. What's interesting from my perspective is that we selected this book for our district and our community in part because it is 12 stories that stand alone. And that makes the book so teachable because we can pick and choose these stories and explore them more deeply. But when you envisioned this as a finished product, why did you choose the route of 12 short stories rather than a continuous story? I'm fascinated by it because they're all set in the same setting of Appalachia, but they transcend time. They have multiple themes and a wide array of characters. I'm very interested why you found this to be the best way to tell the story of Appalachia as opposed to one continuous story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, novels. So, you know, there are times when I've chosen another way, but I felt like for this book, and this is the short story collection I'm most proud of, I really wanted to give within just 12 stories, just almost like 12 photographs of different times, and yet they kind of bleed into one another. They, you know, mixing my metaphors here, but we start to see echoes, and we start to see all sorts of things intertwined as we go through them. But it felt like the best way. I've always admired, there's a book I read when I was a teenager, Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. And I love that book because it's about a small town in Ohio, and yet the stories are different, but once again, they're kind of intertwined. And ultimately, I think what we get is a sense of a place that would be richer than maybe a novel, because in a sense, we're seeing just these kind of crucial moments where we get insight into characters, but also into a community, and very often in crisis, depression, Civil War, World War II, opioid epidemic, all of those moments. And so I felt, I hope that for someone who doesn't know the region, that there is a sense of this place, the geography. I hope, you know, one thing that's important to me is I want the reader to have a real sense of the landscape, and in a way, the landscape sometimes almost reflecting the harshness of the characters. Sometimes it works the other way. but yeah, and I think, one thing I've learned is that for me, deciding whether I should put together a collection of stories or write a novel or actually a book of poems, it ultimately is intuitive. Sometimes it just feels right. And this did, but I spent a lot of time deciding which stories would go where. I had 4, actually one of my favorite stories that I've ever written. It wouldn't fit in this book. I put it in my next collection, and it's, one of the 2 or 3 stories that I feel are my best, one of my best, and yet it didn't fit. I had to have everything fit in this book, and so as I said earlier, I hope that with a good CD, that ultimately the reader will feel a sense of completeness, a sense that something has gone on here that works as an individual experience. I think of a couple of Bruce Springsteen albums where I get a sense of that he's given us a place, and it's very often that New Jersey landscape. But I feel like, he's given me that world around Asbury Park, and yet at the same time he's done that. I mean, the songs come together for me, particularly I think, when I first saw that in Born to Run, I just really, when he describes the amusement park being bold and stark and kids huddling in the mist. I mean, wow, that's so visual. And yet I understand all those characters, what they're searching for. And like a lot of my characters, they're trapped, in that album, that CD, and they're trying to find ways out. And I think we all understand that sense. I mean, some of our traps are not as devastating as others, but yeah, I love that. I love accents. I obviously have kept mine, but I love that sense of that we can, I get a sense of that of accents of a particular place. But here's the quote I think sums this up. Eudora Welty, a writer from Mississippi, said that one place comprehended makes us understand all other places better. So if, Springsteen can show me Asbury Park, but he's also telling me something about my own place ultimately. When I read some of the great Russian writers, Chekhov is, a short story writer I greatly admire. He's writing about very often rural Russia. So not always, sometimes both, but I just sense that he's telling me about my place also. So yeah, and using those individual stories, and I think that's the best. Yeah, that's the best correlation. And I felt like I wanted this to have the feel of a Springsteen CD. How's that?
Wait, didn't he just come out with a new one? Doesn't he have a 2020? I was going to that the other day. It's actually pretty good, and it does exactly what you say. I guess the Born to Run, maybe that's like an 80s album. So
I thought the best response to 9/11 was The Rising, that CD that he did. Mm-hmm. Really does exactly what we're talking about. I mean, that he's looking at, the incredible trauma of that event, 9/11. And yet within that, there is something rising, hope.
Right.
Something's burning bright, even with all that darkness.
Right.
I just need to interject to apologize on behalf of New Jersey that Tanya was not clear on when Born to Run was released, because it's something that most New Jersey understand.
It was the 80s, right? But I was correct. Was it the 80s? It was the 80s?
It was the 80s.
Okay. All right.
I actually saw it right after that album came out. He came to the Appalachian Mountain and
really
performance, and it was so amazing. I mean, I know we're getting off subject here, but I think it's an amazing moment where those guys in that band, Clemens, all those guys, they knew they'd done something magnificent, and they were just jubilant. I mean, he tends to be that way, but I mean, it was just like this sense of, wow, it wasn't arrogance. It was just this sense of knowing, yeah, we've locked into something. And sometimes when I write, I hope, and sometimes I do feel like I've locked in. I've got this thing right, or as right as I can get it. And Burning Bright had that feeling for me, which is why it's my favorite collection.
Well, anyone that I've ever spoken to about this book knows that probably my favorite story, and I know I said Lincolnites is one of my favorites, but probably my favorite is the Ascent. And you did elaborate on the Ascent a lot today in our earlier presentation for the kids. I feel like the Ascent was such a powerful story, and Tanya and I actually went back and forth with that story a couple different times because we interpreted the ending differently from each other. So not that I want you to talk about the ending really, because there could be people on who haven't read it yet, and it is one of the best, I think. But if you could talk about your process in writing that book, or writing that story, because you said that it was kind of years in the making, that one.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience because years ago there was a plane crash near where I live in the North Carolina mountains. It was in a national forest. It was a very small plane, a Cessna, 2-seater, I guess, maybe 4. And the plane crashed. They knew it had gone down, but they couldn't find it. And 6 years passed, still had not found the plane. And a bear hunter actually came upon it in the woods. And I read an article about when they found it. It was only about 2 or 3 paragraphs that the plane had been found. And I knew there was a story there. I mean, I just knew it immediately. So I cut out the article. I put it on my bureau where I would see it every day. And this went on for several years. I kept thinking, what is the story? There's got to be a story here. And I was kind of on track where I kept thinking, well, it's got to be the bear hunter. Something's going to happen when he comes upon this. Is he going to rob them? How is he going to react? Is this going to reflect something in him? And I just never could feel that click that I get when a story works. And then one day, after a number of years, by this time I wasn't reading it. I would just kind of see it and glance and just know it was there. But then one day I just thought, an image came to me of a child's footsteps in the snow, and then the child. And I realized that child was going to find this plane. And that was kind of the first part. I knew I had something. That was good. But then when the story I really knew I had what I wanted, and I got excited about the story, was what if what he sees in there and that plane does not frighten him? And that's when I knew that I had the story, because I knew that there was something that he found more horrific than that. And once that occurred, I knew I had a story. I had the story that I kind of, I think on some subconscious level, I knew that something had to happen. And that's when I knew that story, or I felt that story was going to work. And I feel like that is probably my favorite story in that collection, personally. But I wanted that story to show the real horror of drugs. And there is one thing I've deliberately done, and you see this in Burning Bright. You notice that I don't have a story from a dealer, drug pusher's point of view. I don't even really have a story from I don't have a story from the user's point of view. And I have a problem sometimes. Breaking Bad was really well done. I admire that show in many ways, but I feel like too often when we have a show or a book from that point of view, we start to identify with the user or the drug pusher. And I don't, in a way, it almost glamorizes that experience. I don't want to glamorize it. And I found that the way I can not do that most successfully is to show the victims who are on, particularly as in Back of Beyond, the parents, and in the Ascent, the child. And I hope that the story has another level of complexity and poignancy, and that the parents, in their own flawed way, are trying to be good parents. To me, that's where the heartbreak of the story is. That we can't it's not easy for us to demonize these parents. So, yeah. And you do bring up a good point. I think once, it's interesting because sometimes a person will tell me, well, how should I read a story? And I think once the writer kind of lets the story go out there, the reader will read it. And different readers are going to interpret differently, not because necessarily one reading is always superior to another, but it's what we talked about earlier, that when I read a story, or when you read a story, we're looking at splotches of ink on a page. And if those characters become real, if we see those characters, we feel connected to those characters, it becomes a kind of act of communion. But we're creating the story as well. And so we're bringing part of ourselves into that story. And so to me, it's not that surprising. I mean, I always find it interesting when I have people who read a character might be viewed as sympathetic. I'll have one reader read this character as sympathetic, another not. And part of that would probably be experience. Perhaps something happened in a person's life that would alter that. Or as you are helping me create this story, you're bringing in a part of yourself. And I think that's fine. I think, I don't want someone saying that, for instance, that the Ascent is really about Led Zeppelin's breakup. I'm not going to buy any interpretation necessarily, but I do think that very often, as in real life, different situations are so complex that we don't get those easy answers. So that, what I may view in some ways as a heartless act, someone else might view in a more positive way.
Going off of that, and I don't mean to extend this discussion about this story, but I did love the story so much. But you mentioned that his parents were actually, in the way that they knew best, trying to be good parents. But what I guess I found most tragic and most heart-wrenching was that Jared was really trying to be a good son.
Yeah.
And in so many ways, I sense that he knew that his mother wasn't really sick. She was sick, but I think he had a sense that, the reason she was sick was not just because she had a cold or something. I think he sensed that. I think he understood that to a certain level. But for him to, return to the plane, get the watch, bring it back, give it to his father to go sell and bring back money to make mom better. It was just so, it was just heart-wrenching, so while they were trying to be good parents to the degree that they could, he was so trying to be a good son.
Yeah, well, that to me is, the heartbreak of the story. Absolutely.
So if you look at that also in terms of Back of Beyond, though, like the parents ended up in the trailer because they thought they were also trying to be good parents, but that wasn't good parenting. If your kids your child who has an addiction has taken over your home and your brother has to come save you by, kicking them out. And so I think that it goes back to kind of Mike's point about when we chose this book and the types of conversations we want to have. And I think that this book kind of transcends culture, right? So if we were to go into some urban communities, we could still have these same conversations around drug use and drug abuse and how it affects their children and their families and some of the underlying systemic problems that led to those addictions in those communities, rural or urban.
Oh,
Kind of
absolutely.
with the poverty too. Yeah. So we wanted to be able to have conversations that would lead to other conversations. And so when we talk about class, that transcends race, that kind of transcends everything else, because you have people in a variety of cultures who are experiencing poverty and drugs and all of those things. So I think the work is really important in that sense too, because it can be a bridge to some of those more difficult conversations where maybe we don't have all of those things.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that I think as human beings, particularly in our country, and I think this is really important today, is that we're more alike than different. I mean, that my landscape might be different, but what's happening to these people who, and it is, very often class, it is class, a lot of it, or opportunity, I would hope, and I hope today that I suspect some of those students have seen very similar situations, that they are, but some of them are probably caught in those situations. And I think they would understand the complexity of it. And, I've seen the problem in my own family. I lost my first cousin died because of drugs. And so, as I say, I wanted to write about it, but I didn't want to write about it in a way that simplified it. And so I hope that was my goal. I view myself as a writer, not necessarily as an advocate, but more as a witness. I want to kind of show this. I don't want to tell my audience what to think about it. I just want to put it out there as truthfully as I can, and I hope with a good degree of complexity that is a real complexity of human motivations and needs and desires. And then, let the reader ponder and connect.
So I wanted to ask a question that we received on Twitter from one of our own teachers, Miss Plewick, and her entire class. And I think this is a great question because it shifts gears a little bit, especially as we kind of come to the home stretch of this keynote. And I know that Tanya and Christy would agree with me, as we've become a little bit experienced in hosting authors through the NEA Big Read program. We found that not only does our audience want to know more about the book, but they also want to know more about the author, him or herself personally. And that's where this comes from. And I'm going to expand on it a little bit, because the question is, what does it feel like to be a published author? And I think in this context, we can expand on that. You've experienced, obviously, so much success. You've traveled the world. Do you ever, I know this is a cliche, but do you ever pinch yourself? Do you ever sit back and wonder, how did I get here? And I'm sure you don't take it for granted, but what does it feel like to be not only a published author, but such an accomplished published author?
Well, it is like a dream in many ways. I mean, I would never have thought that I would have the readership that I have, the success. I mean, when I started out, my hope was maybe to, publish in a few good journals, maybe have maybe a couple of books with a small press. And that was pretty much what happened for about the first 25 years of my writing. I published in some good places, a few good places. I had very small publications, book publications. And it was only after I was, about 25 years of writing that I published my first book in New York with a major press. And I think that was good for me, because I don't think if I'd had success very quickly, I'm not so sure that would have been good. A lot of times I think that's maybe the worst thing that can happen to a writer, because it can throw you off balance maybe. And you might not be writing as well as you should. I mean, I needed a long apprenticeship. I didn't need to be writing or publishing because my work wasn't good enough. And I knew that. I mean, I burned 2 novels I'd read enough to where I knew they weren't good, but that was okay. That I was learning my craft. And I think when the successes did come, and the much higher success of once I published in New York and had that kind of attention to my work, I was ready to handle it. It wasn't going to really throw me off balance, but also I knew that I was writing at a level where certainly I knew that my work had flaws, but I also knew that I was writing probably about as well as I could. That, I had learned my craft well enough to where I wasn't going to publish a book that probably shouldn't be published. In the sense that I wasn't to the point where I could write as well as I was capable. So I think it really hasn't changed my life that much. I do travel more, but I still kind of live a very private life. I still, it's just as hard every day. Every time I sit down to write, it doesn't get any easier. But that's okay too. But yeah, it's been a wonder, and I've been really happily surprised. But as I mentioned to the students, when I was about 25, 26 years old, I made a decision in my life that I would rather try to do this. And when I said that to myself, I was talking about not just trying for a year. I was looking at the rest of my life. I'm that way. I tend to be very obsessive, but that I would rather fail at this than not know if I could do it. And that to me was, and I think even without this, I've had more success than I thought, but I really believe this, that if it had been, and luck and timing play a role in getting published and getting attention. If I'd published a few books with small presses and a few good journals, and that's all I'd done, it would still be worth it because I'd done what I wanted to do with my life. I feel very fortunate in that, two things that I really have enjoyed. Sometimes it's not easy, but it is ultimately something I feel is worthwhile, the writing and the teaching. That I've been able to do those, two jobs, and I felt like I got something more than monetary reward from it. And I continue to teach. I continue to love to teach. I feel lucky that I've been able to do two occupations that way because I've known many friends who made a lot of money, but they got no joy out of their work. They got no sense that they've done something important. And I think as teachers, we feel that we have. I think the danger, or what I've always feared, was I was going to hurt students. But I think ultimately, most of us who are serious about it, we do a lot of good. We do the best we can. Yeah. Yeah. My daughter, as I mentioned, my daughter teaches in New Jersey now, and my son teaches elementary and actually has now become vice principal. So they know what they're getting into because my wife's an English teacher. She was a high school English teacher. So they have no illusions about how tough a job it is, but they also know the rewards.
Mike, do we have another Twitter question, or can I just kind of expand on something that Ron said real fast?
Go ahead.
Short on time. Okay. So you, Mr. Rash, you mentioned that it was like 25 years before you really saw a lot of success, and in all that time, for all of those years, what did you do to get better? Like what would you have for a budding author who's 25 and makes the decision to I'm going to just go for it like you did? What do you do to get better?
Well, I've always been a voracious reader, and every writer I know who's any good is also a voracious reader. So I continue to read intensely. I always have read, and I continue to read now. But I kept learning. I kept trying to read writers very different from myself. I would read writers from different countries. I would read urban writers. I would read writers who wrote, I'd read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I would read Dostoevsky, who continues to be maybe my the writer who had the biggest influence on me. I would read Baudelaire, a French poet. I would read Achibi. I would read, I was reading Mo Yan from China. It's a writer I really connect with. He's still alive. He won a Nobel Prize a few years ago. So I was reading all these writers. I was trying to read as many as I could from different places. I was reading for different things. I was trying to learn, for instance, I might learn how to pace a novel from Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. I learned about language from reading writers such as Morrison and Faulkner, but also Annie Proulx, who is a really, really beautiful writer. So I was learning my trade. I was learning my trade or my craft, but I was also writing. And I pretty much wrote every day. And I mean, every day, at least, a couple hours. And gradually, it got better. I mean, there were, story after story didn't work. And I think maybe one of the most important breakthroughs was when I realized that I always had what I thought would be a great idea for a story. And what I found was that when I would start writing the story, it just didn't feel alive. It felt forced. And it was almost as if I'd put it on a single track, like a railroad track, and the story couldn't make those moves, those surprises that delight us as readers, but also as writers. And I started to write more and more intuitively. I actually would, most of my stories and novels now start with an image. The Ascent started with the image of that young man, Jared, walking through the snow. I mean, that's all. I knew he was going to find that plane, but I didn't really know anything else. To me, so the surprise in that story was that moment when I suddenly realized he's not frightened, but I started to trust not knowing exactly where the story was going. And I think that was probably one of the big breakthroughs for me because it opened up possibilities of the story that I wouldn't have imagined otherwise. And the other thing I think was that I realized that I was a slow writer and that I needed to do a lot of drafts. I'd say every story in this collection went through 15 drafts. Full drafts. As I get toward the last draft, it's purely about sound. I'm listening to how vowels and consonants rub up against each other, the length of sentences. And I don't want to draw attention to that, but I hope that when the reader reads it, there's a sense, I think sometimes when I read writers that I really love, that I'm gliding. There's not awkward sentences or awkward words or piled up long words, things that would kind of slow me down or draw attention to themselves. So all those things became important, but it was very slow. I was a slow developing writer, and I think anyone who would have read my work when I was 19, I wasn't writing that much, but in my early 20s would not see a great deal of promise there. And I actually had someone, a pretty noted writer, tell me I had no talent. And that was okay. That's okay. And I tell my students about that because I think one thing that you have to learn is that you've got to me, that can work in different ways, but it just made me want to prove myself even more. But because I can remember after hearing that, I went back because it was when I was in graduate school, and I was really hurt. And he did it in a kind of a mean-spirited way. I would never do this to a student. It taught me a lot about how to deal with students too. But I got back and I was kind of feeling sorry for myself. And I looked at the story and I realized he was right. The things he pointed out were right. And I kind of told myself, you got to get past this kind of ego thing. You've got to realize it's about the work, and that ultimately he's done you a favor because he's reminded you, or maybe not reminded, but shown you, how far you need to go. And I actually got to know that writer years later. I never brought this up, and I still haven't. I've never given his name, but he actually took a story of mine years later for an anthology he was putting together. But it was. I think you have to. My point being that you have to deal with a certain level of discouragement, rejection. I mean, and that's part of it too. Yeah.
Well, kudos to you for not pointing that out.
Well, it was. I mean, he was right. I mean, and as I say, I would never have done it that way. And I think it really could have hurt another kind of writer. But there's a part of me that has always, when people told me I couldn't do something, it just made me want to do it harder. So that was good. It worked out. Yeah.
That to me feels like the perfect anecdote to kind of wrap this up because of timing, but that is perfect. That after all of this hour and a half of insight, well, more than that, because this is your second keynote presentation of the day, that you still have the humility to, acknowledge criticism, and it's an inspiration, I'm sure, as it was for all of our students and teachers and everyone watching tonight. I know I personally enjoyed your presentation immensely. I've learned so much, and we're just so happy to have been able to host you, Mr. Rash.
Well, Ron, and your own first name basis, but no, it's been wonderful. And as I said, my one regret is that I couldn't be there personally, but there may come another time. As I said, my daughter's up there, and I'd love to see Tom's River. I've read about it in Richard Ford's novels, so I have a sense of the landscape there. It's been a great experience, and I appreciate you all inviting me.
It was our thrill and our honor, and just thank you very much. I'd also like to thank everyone who has tuned in tonight. I hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. And Tanya and Christy, anything to add before we?
Thank you so much. It was really amazing. It was great meeting you and listening to you, and I'm so impressed, and I'm going out. I know your stuff.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ron.
Good, thank you. All right, have a good evening.
You too.
Good night, everyone who joined us.
Bye, guys. Bye, Mike. Bye, Christy. Bye, Ron.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.